Today we're going to start a two-part series on antidepressants. I'm going to post part 2 tomorrow. It's already written up. The goal of this series is to help educate you guys on what these drugs are, how they work, and to kind of help us think critically about whether or not they really benefit us, and to give an overview to help you guys make a conscious decision on how you want to be treated for your depression. I'm not a doctor, but I do think when it comes to these medications, because they're so widely prescribed, we have to do some research, talk to our doctors, and figure out if these treatments that we're being given are what we actually want. So let's get into it. We can't talk about antidepressants without talking about depression. Antidepressants also are used for other conditions like anxiety, but we're only gonna revolve around depression today. Clinical depression is something I'm very familiar with, so I'm gonna share what I've felt and then share some general facts and ideas. Depression is a mood disorder characterized by low mood, lack of interest in things. This can be things that cause you joy or things in general. Little to no motivation. This could be motivation just get up in the morning, could be motivation to brush your teeth, eat food. All of that's under the same umbrella. It's a condition that can cause you to want to sleep a lot. I know when I was very depressed in the past, I just wanted to sleep because at least that gave me a break from the hopelessness that I was feeling. You might also be irritable or have little to no joy for the things you like to do in your life. Depression can be caused by things like trauma, a breakup can initiate some depression, a crisis of meaning. What I mean by that is a lot of people, younger people, I'm still young, can be stuck in trying to figure out like what I want to do with my life, where am I in life? And those big questions can cause some depression that can vary in intensity. But those types of situations can knock us off our feet a little bit. I mentioned hopelessness. There's low energy to no energy. This numbness. When I was depressed, I felt very numb. I'm a very emotional guy, and emotions are a big part of my life. But when I was depressed, I had little to no emotion. It was very odd. Also, suicidal ideation. Suicidal ideations are just thoughts of suicide. You might not actually want to do it, but you might be thinking about it in passing or actively. In my opinion, depression is a spectrum, but you can find it in conditions like major depressive disorder, seasonal affective disorder, which is basically depression that occurs with changes of seasons or around the same time every year. You can also find depression in bipolar disorder. This includes bipolar 1 and 2. We'll get more into that in part 2. The main question with depression is how do we treat it? A lot of doctors will just give you medication. Some doctors will do a more thorough analysis to figure out what you need. A lot of people do therapy. Some people do therapy and medication or just medication. There's different ways to treat depression, different types of medications and different types of therapies. It's a relatively complex situation. So let's dive a little bit deeper into what antidepressants are. Antidepressants are a class of medications that treat things like major depressive disorder, anxiety disorders, and other things. There are all kinds of types of antidepressants like SSRIs, SNRIs, and DRIs like Wellbutrin or bupropion. Lamotrigine, which is an epilepsy drug, but it's also heavily used for bipolar 1 and 2. And in these drug types, there's all sorts of different drugs. We're going to talk about some of them today. It is thought that depression is caused by some sort of imbalance of the brain chemistry. In my opinion, I think it's much more complex than that, and that's a part of the debate as well. Antidepressants are very well known for their side effects. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. They vary in intensity, and they depend on the drug type. The big question that I want us to think about, and this is something we'll talk about in part 2, is do these drugs do more harm than good? Now, this debate is going on actively between a lot of doctors and researchers because of these side effects. The risk versus reward, is it worth it? We're going to talk about that through this whole series. The whole point of this series is to give you a general, but I think well-educated understanding on the whole situation with antidepressants. What's interesting is that sometimes you'll find a black box warning on these drugs saying that these may increase the risk or thoughts of suicide. SSRIs are pretty much the most common antidepressants prescribed. They are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. The biochemistry is beyond the scope of this channel, but what we're talking about here is that this neurotransmitter serotonin that regulates mood and other things, along with other molecules, when they move through the neurotransmitters, they have to be reabsorbed. You don't want all those molecules steadily sending messages. These drugs stop serotonin from being reabsorbed, increasing the amount, and the idea is that if there's more serotonin, then your mood is more regulated. These drugs are heavily prescribed. well over 8 million between the years of 2021 and 2022. America is currently a very depressed nation, and because of this, a lot of these drugs have been prescribed. Unfortunately, these have a lot of side effects like headache, nausea, blunted mood. I've taken some of these drugs, and one of the things that I hated was that I didn't feel like myself. My mood was completely flat. I didn't have any emotions. For me, at some point, I was like, I'd rather be depressed than have almost no emotion. Low sex drive. This is a common side effect. You have little to no interest in anything sexual at all. Sweating. When I took some of these drugs, I would go to bed and then wake up in like a pool of sweat, almost like I ran a marathon. Weight gain. I'm a relatively slim guy, but when I took some of these drugs, I gained a lot of weight. Now, it wasn't a whole lot, but it was significant to me at least. And this is an issue with some people that take these. And some people are prescribed other medications to help with weight gain. Again, this is a part of the issue. Some physicians will give you medications to help deal with the side effects of the medication you're taking. It's a lot going on. Low motivation, worsening depression, increased anxiety. The discussion behind the effectiveness of these drugs revolves around things like blunted mood, depression, anxiety. If you're taking an antidepressant for your depression and your antidepressant makes you more depressed, what's the point? So these clinical findings are what drives this discussion of whether or not these drugs are worth taking. It takes some time for these drugs to work, 2 to 4 weeks. I know when I took Lexapro, I was told that it might take a few months for me to feel normal again. The thing also is that we know that they work. The specifics of their function and mechanisms are not fully understood, which is really interesting. They can also cause some nasty side effects like serotonin syndrome, which is a pretty nasty condition caused by an overload of serotonin. It has a whole bunch of different presentations that are relatively dangerous, or very dangerous actually. There are many different types of SSRIs. We're just going to talk about a few of them. First, we're going to talk about escitalopram or Lexapro. This is used for major depressive disorder, general anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder. This was the first SSRI that I took, and I absolutely hated it. Why? Well, it gave me a lot of headaches. I had a lot of nausea. I felt a little jittery. My mood was very blunted. It was a terrible experience. So some of the adverse effects, like I mentioned, nausea, insomnia, headache, can make you very sleepy. I didn't get the sleepiness or the insomnia, but I got the nausea and the headache pretty consistently. And then Celexa is another one. Now this is almost a cousin to Lexapro. Why? Well, the only difference is here and here. So you see escitalopram and citalopram, they're very similar. I just want to show that little connection. And then there's fluoxetine or Prozac. Prozac, I took this after Lexapro, and I think I hated this one even more than I hated Lexapro. Prozac is used for conditions like major depressive disorder, bulimia, OCD, premenstrual dysphoria disorder. What this is during the menstrual cycle, it's already hard enough dealing with pain and emotional swings. PMDD is like a more intense version, large swings of emotion and other symptoms. I hated Prozac mainly because I felt very sedated. Now, I don't think this is a very common side effect. It didn't matter what time I took this drug. Playing around with the times is important. The morning, afternoon, night, regardless, after a couple hours, I would feel like doing nothing. Energy was drained, my mood was blunted, I just felt like a vegetable. And I'm not trying to make any joke, I'm not trying to offend anyone who is a vegetable, but it made me feel like I just didn't want to do anything. I just felt blunted. It was pretty horrible. The adverse effects for this drug are insomnia, headache, anxiety, nausea. Now, I believe nausea is a very common one. I did get nausea and weight gain. So I experienced this sedation. I don't think SSRIs are for me, but these two made me decide I will never take these drugs ever again. Then we have sertraline or Zoloft. Now, Zoloft apparently is more tolerable. I've never taken it. So for anyone that's taking these drugs, please comment if you want to, because I'd love to know what your experience was like. A lot of these side effects and profiles are very general. Everyone has a different experience. So I'd love to see some comments to see how it really affected you. This is used for major depressive disorder, general anxiety disorder, seasonal affective disorder, PMDD, like we talked about before, post-stroke depression. The adverse effects can be sleepiness, headache, insomnia, nausea, dry mouth. As you can see, a lot of these have the same side effects. Then we have SNRIs, serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. They do a very similar thing that SSRIs do, except they also stop norepinephrine from being absorbed. This is another chemical that helps regulate mood. Again, it's just a different design, I guess, with the hope of being more effective depending on the condition. SSRIs and SNRIs vary in their effectiveness. The side effects can be weight loss or weight gain sometimes, low blood pressure, nausea, vomiting, headache, suicidal thoughts, sexual dysfunction, insomnia, and others. The withdrawals from these drugs can be very intense. You can experience nausea, flu-like symptoms, anxiety, insomnia. What's interesting is that tramadol, the opioid, is an SNRI. I thought that was very interesting. In general, with both of these categories, SSRIs or SNRIs, you have to wean off them. You can't just stop them cold turkey because you will go through pretty intense withdrawal. And the longer you take them, the heavier the withdrawal will be, so you have to slowly taper off. It's similar to any drug, but the ones that affect mood or the opioids are ones you really have to slowly taper off. So lastly, let's talk about the common SNRIs. The first one is venlafaxine, Effexor. This can be a first line of treatment for depression, as in it can be the first medication that's suggested. It really depends. I wasn't suggested this one, but I know those who have. It's used for major depressive disorder, general or social anxiety, panic disorder. The adverse effects can include headache, erectile dysfunction, loss of strength, sweating, and others. Then you have duloxetine or Cymbalta. This is used for major depressive disorder, neuropathic pain, general anxiety disorder, osteoarthritis, stress incontinence. This one is a really interesting profile in that it's used for all sorts of different things. Arthritis being the joint condition, stress incontinence being urinary accidents or urinary incontinence, peeing on yourself that stems from things like coughing or sneezing, stuff like that. The interesting about Cymbalta, at least from what I read, there is a 2 times suicidality increase or risk in children and adolescents, a 1.5 times risk in those from 18 to 24. This is a part of that discussion, and I'm gonna bring up some data in the next part on antidepressants in children and adolescents. This is another very complex situation because these drugs affect adults in a lot of ways, but children in their development, there's a lot of debate on whether or not it's even necessary to medicate children like that, but that's the next part. The adverse effects can include insomnia, dizziness, constipation, low appetite. This drug can also be used, well, it's being studied for cancer pain and surgery. In general, these drugs, while they're used to treat these conditions, offer these very interesting adverse effects. Let's get into the summary and close out this video. We started out talking about depression, low mood, little to no interest in things, hopelessness, low energy. Depression is present in all sorts of different conditions, and it's treated very differently depending on the person. We then got into what they are. They're a class of medications used to treat depression and other conditions. There's all kinds of different medications, SSRIs, SNRIs, and they're known for their adverse effects and side effects depending on the drug and drug type. Their effectiveness is in question amongst a lot of researchers and physicians. We learned about SSRIs, these drugs that keep serotonin flowing in your body. Millions were prescribed between 2021 and 2022, but they have a whole host of side effects like headache, nausea, weight gain, low sex drive, and they can take a little time to kick in. Then we went over the common SSRIs like Lexapro, Prozac, Zoloft, some of which I have taken. While they're used to treat some of these common conditions, we did discuss their adverse effects, which are relatively noteworthy. Then we got into SNRIs. They function very similarly to SSRIs, except norepinephrine is thrown in the mix. These have a whole host of side effects that can include weight loss, suicidal thoughts, insomnia, nausea. They do have a pretty intense withdrawal process, just like SSRIs. and both categories vary in how effective they are. Lastly, we learned about the common SNRIs, Effexor, Cymbalta. They're used for all sorts of conditions as we've mentioned, but they also have some very questionable adverse effects, just like the SSRIs. So that's all I got for this part of this series. As I mentioned before, the whole goal for this series is to provide education for those who have wondered about antidepressants, who might be taking them, or who might be thinking about taking them. It's important to take advantage or control of your health, because oftentimes you can be prescribed medications that you think are just going to work, when in reality it's a complex situation. Sometimes people can bounce from medication to medication, doses going up and down. There's a lot going on that I think some people don't realize they're getting themselves into. Now, I'm not a doctor. I'm not saying that you shouldn't take these drugs. What I'm saying is that it's important to understand what you're being given, to learn about what this stuff is, and decide, is this what I want to do? Do I want to take this drug with these potentials? Because I mentioned there's a lot of debate, and it's really important to really understand what you're putting in your body and how you want to treat the conditions that you are currently going through. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Please like, comment, subscribe, tell your friends, and I'll be back soon with part 2 in this series.